Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her two daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. Okay, here we find a couple of interesting developments. First, God proved faithful to the people of Israel by ending the famine and providing food. Exactly what this family should have stayed there and let him prove and do. Second, Naomi decides to leave Moab and go back home to Bethlehem. She really didn't have a choice. It was a patriarchal society. Everything for a woman depended on a father, a brother, a husband, or a son. At her age, her parents are likely dead. There's certainly no mention of them being alive, much less the existence of any brothers. Her husband was dead. Both of her sons were dead. Her hopes of remarriage were just about non-existent, as she was old enough to be past the childbearing age. And in that day, being able to bear a child was really what a woman brought to a marriage. In that patriarchal society, sad as it is, that was her value. And providing an heir, and particularly a son, that was everything. And so she didn't have that in her options either. But notice the life lesson that was standing right in front of her. One you hope that she got by going to Moab, everything falling apart, and then seeing that everything got better from what she fled, and now she was chasing back after that. She and her family had fled instead of staying and trusting in God. And what happened? They ran right into a nightmare, death and poverty, while those who stayed in Jerusalem saw the famine end and found God faithful. But on the way, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye. They all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Well, why should you go with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I'm too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, well, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." Remember, Moabites and Israelites weren't exactly friends. They were often enemies. Moab had severely mistreated Israel in the past. They had even invaded and cruelly occupied them once for an 18-year run. And not only had Naomi fled to Moab with her husband and sons, but her sons had married Moabite women. That's who Orpah and Ruth were. They were Moabites. This was so frowned on, so denounced, that any children, offspring from such a marriage, would be excluded from the Jewish faith for 10 generations. That's how reviled Moabites were by Israelites. So how do you think Naomi, returning to Israel with a couple of Moabite daughters-in-law, how was that going to go over? Well, try like a lead balloon. So you could easily read this as Naomi saying, "Oh, no, you really should go home," and it's all just wanting to shed that baggage before she got back to Israel, to get these two young Moabite women out of her life before she returned to Israel. And then she could probably deny that her sons ever married Moabite women, or she could even deny she was ever in Moab. So this wasn't a selfless act, it was a selfish act. It was bad enough that she and her husband had left Israel and gone to Moab, but to have her sons marry Moabite women was even worse. And now, having to return home, hat in hand, having lost everything, with two Moabite daughters-in-law would be unthinkable, even if it meant sending them back to a pagan land to continue to worship their false gods and to marry other pagan men, fellow Moabites. So when reading this, and trying to determine whether Naomi is this good, godly, nurturing woman or a hot mess, so far I think we can lean toward the hot mess. But we'll find out more, actually, in just a minute. And again, they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die. and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. Ruth didn't leave and return to those pagan gods, and not in disobedience to Naomi, but because of the kind of woman she was, and particularly the kind of woman she had become. In fact, let's start piecing together the parts of the picture we've already been given of this remarkable young woman. First, we saw this raw, selfless, complete commitment to the family of her husband, even when she had been formally released and encouraged to return home after his death. She could have remarried, but instead, knowing that it would surely mean never marrying, for it was doubtful that any Jewish man in Israel would choose to marry a Moabite, she was still choosing to stay with Naomi. But not simply out of family commitment. There was something else going on here. We learned that Ruth had become a believer and a follower of the God of Israel. Her desire to stay with Naomi was not simply to be committed, but to go with her to Israel where she could worship the living God and become part of the people of God. Naomi's God, whether Naomi followed him or honored him herself, had become Ruth's God. And Ruth's faith was sincere and real and alive. Naomi was going home to her people and her God for the sake of trying to find a better life. Ruth was choosing to go to Israel, knowing that it could mean life gets worse, never marrying, being an outcast, turning her back on her homeland and her only hope of a good life. But she was going to do it for God. Naomi felt that God was against her. Ruth felt, I think God's for us. So do you see the difference between these two women and how remarkable and deep Ruth's faith is in comparison to Naomi's? So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. In the Hebrew, it reads that it caused an event. It wasn't like, yay, Naomi. It was like, hey, Naomi, So they were exercised almost by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women asked. Don't call me Naomi, she responded. Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. The word Mara means bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Okay, I think that's the final confirmation Naomi's a mess. She gets home and says she left there happy and full, which was a lie. And the first thing out of her mouth when she gets back is to tell people they ought to call her Mara instead of Naomi. Call me bitter. And then she tears into God. God has made life bitter for me. God has brought me home empty. God has caused me to suffer. God has sent tragedy on me. I mean, wow. Well, that brings us to the end of Act 1 in this story with this simple line in conclusion. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. And as Warren Wiersbe adds, that Naomi was a woman who arrived with empty hands, an empty home, and an empty heart. And that's where we'll pick up the story next week. But get ready, buckle your seatbelts. While we were introduced to Ruth in a powerful and compelling way, don't forget the life lesson that was missed by her mother-in-law. And again, that is that the safest place to be is always in the center of God's will. And we'll find next week that while Ruth is taking a bungee jump of faith and going with Naomi, she is firmly in God's will, which means her adventure, and it's an adventure, is just beginning.